Okay, so I just talked about how Texas is part of the larger thrust of U.S. history, but let's go back to the period between the early 1820s when Moses Austin and then Stephen F. Austin start bringing Anglo families into Texas. Other impresarios bring families into Texas as well, but I'm not going to burden you with the detail of all that. Just get a general sense that Americans with their slaves are coming into Texas beginning in the 1820s. And Austin really is the most important of these. Folks are coming into Texas from the US because land is much cheaper than it is in the United States. But at the same time, they're worried about coming into Texas, Americans during the Mexican period, because they don't really trust the Mexican government, because the Mexican government as a whole and the Mexican people are anti-slavery. And so one of the things that Americans had in the US was the US government offered ironclad protections for slavery. Slavery is woven deeply into the Constitution, into the laws governing the United States. The US would send the army to protect slavery if there were slave revolts. So you had the power of the US government protecting slavery in the US. You didn't have that in Mexican Texas. The Mexican government, first of all, was very weak in Texas, but secondly, most Mexicans opposed slavery, except for the Tejanos that lived in Mexican Texas, because they want a piece of the cotton trade, and they know Americans won't come into Texas unless that they can bring their slaves with them. So there's this whole story about slavery in Texas. Let me make a couple points, and I'll repeat myself, but I don't care. It's just the way I teach. First of all, Stephen F. Austin doesn't come into Texas to steal he doesn't come into Mexican Texas to steal it for the United States. He was not an agent of the United States. Stephen F. Austin genuinely, the record shows, he genuinely wanted Texas to work as a state in Mexico. He learned Spanish. He worked with Mexican authorities. He worked with Tejano authorities. He really was genuine in wanting Texas to be a state within Mexico. But, and this is the significant point, Texas had to be the only slave state in Mexico. That was the deal breaker for Austin, and that was the deal breaker for other Anglos that came into Mexican Texas. They're more or less willing to work with Mexico. Austin was very much willing to. Others coming in were much less so. But Austin, I think, was quite genuine about that. But even Austin, for him, the key thing was this idea that Texas had to be the one slaveholding state in the Mexican Republic. And so what happens is the question of slavery gets tied into questions about Mexican politics, which I'll develop in other podcasts. And the way to kind of help remember this is it's very easy, and I actually do this a lot myself. You kind of think that Texas is already its own world, its own sovereignty by the 1820s and up until 1836. The trick is, remember, Texas is still part of Mexico until 1836. And most Anglos were willing to accept that. And so what's important, and I think what's really significant about the Tourget book, is he talks about how the question of slavery in Texas becomes enmeshed in Mexican politics. And one of the things about Texas history during this period, and probably even today, is you can't really understand Texas history unless you understand Mexican history, at least a portion of Mexican history. So at this point in the course, between 1820 and 1836, we have to understand two national histories. First of all, that slavery is growing in the Gulf states of the American Southwest, which it was Southwest at the time, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, that national history. But also we have to understand the Mexican national history of a country that for the most part was opposed to slavery, but there were sectors in that country, especially in northern Mexico, in Texas itself, and some folks in Saltillo, who are willing to allow the introduction of slavery into Texas because they want to become part of the global cotton economy. So what we have in the 1820s and up into the Texas Revolution is a clash of two national histories, and also a very, very different view of slavery in Mexico and the United States. And I think it's very rare, I think, that Mexico gets much credit for being as anti-slavery as it was. Mexico takes great pride in the fact that it does not have slavery. And in fact, it's one of the ways that it defines itself against the United States. Mexico admires the US in some ways, but in some ways is very critical of the US. Of course, the US is going to grab half of Mexico by 1850. But one of the ways that Mexico defined itself against the United States was, we don't have slavery and you do. And that's what makes the question about slavery in Texas very, very complicated in the Mexican scenario. And one thing I'll say, just to repeat, because I think this is a story that's unfamiliar to most of you, the story focuses on Saltillo because that's where the fight about slavery in Texas, that's where it's focused, because the Constitution of 1824, it puts so much power into local state governments, including the power to decide whether or not that there would be slavery in Texas or there would be no slavery in Mexican Texas.